Hi there, and welcome to Ku English. In this series, we explore the lives of amazing people and help you improve your English at the same time. Ready? Let's dive in. The Mind That Mapped the Market, The Life of Paul Samuelson. Chapter 1. A Curious Mind in Gary, Indiana. Paul Anthony Samuelson was born on May 15, 1915, in Gary, Indiana, a steel town in the American Midwest. His parents, Frank and Ella Samuelson, were of Jewish descent, and they had immigrated to the United States from Europe seeking a better life. Although Gary was an industrial city, full of noise, smoke, and steel, the Samuelson household was quiet and filled with books. This contrast between the busy outside world and the thoughtful atmosphere at home helped shape Paul's early thinking. Paul was a sickly child, often staying indoors while other children played, but he never seemed bored. His mind was always working. He read everything he could find, from newspapers to old textbooks. While other boys dreamed of being firefighters or baseball players, Paul dreamed of understanding the world. He asked questions, endless questions about prices, machines, newspapers, and even the weather. His father, Frank, was a pharmacist. He owned a small drugstore and worked long hours. Frank hoped his son would become a doctor or take over the family business. But Paul's mind was different. He wasn't drawn to medicine or commerce. He was drawn to ideas. It was Ella, his mother, who first noticed that their boy was more than just smart. He was thoughtful. She made sure he had access to good books and encouraged his interests. In school, Paul was quiet but intense. He did not speak much in class. But when he did, his answers surprised even the teachers. One day, during a lesson on arithmetic, the teacher asked a complex question. Paul, who had been looking out the window moments earlier, suddenly raised his hand. He gave a detailed answer that left the class silent. The teacher smiled and simply said, "That's correct, Paul." It was clear that he was gifted. Paul's early life was not filled with riches or privilege. The Great Depression began when he was still a boy. Times were hard. Many families in Gary struggled to buy food or keep their homes. But for Paul, hardship did not lead to despair. It fueled his desire to understand why such things happened. Why were some people rich and others poor? Why did jobs disappear overnight? What made economies grow or fall? These were not just adult problems to Paul. They were puzzles he wanted to solve. At night, Paul would sometimes lie awake and think about numbers. He loved patterns, especially in prices. He once said, many years later, that his childhood was full of invisible economics. He saw the way people changed their habits when money was tight. He noticed how prices in the store shifted week to week. Even as a young boy, he was watching supply and demand in action. Books became his closest friends. He read fiction, biographies, and even science books. One of his favorite places was the local library, where he would spend hours reading alone. His favorite stories were not just about heroes and battles, but about thinkers, Galileo, Newton, and Einstein. He imagined himself among them, not as a man of war, but as a man of ideas. As Paul grew older, his family moved to Chicago, seeking better opportunities. The city would give Paul more chances to grow academically, but Gary had already planted the seeds of curiosity and ambition. In that noisy steel town, a quiet boy with glasses had begun a journey that would take him to the highest levels of academic and economic thought. Paul Samuelson's story had just begun. Chapter 2. From Chicago to Harvard. A Scholar Awakens. When the Samuelsons moved to Chicago, the shift felt dramatic. The city was larger, louder, and more complex than Gary. But to Paul, it was also full of opportunities. Chicago had excellent public schools, big libraries, and universities that brought new ideas to life. He enrolled in Hyde Park High School, and it didn't take long for his teachers to recognize his brilliance. Paul excelled in every subject, but his real passion began to show in mathematics and logic. Unlike some students who chased grades or popularity, Paul chased understanding. He didn't memorize facts, he questioned them. He once asked his math teacher why a formula worked, not just how. That kind of question deep and persistent, marked his path. Outside of school, Paul continued reading everything he could find, especially in economics, which was starting to interest him more and more. He saw it as the science of real life, the rules behind the way people lived. In 1932, at the age of 17, Paul entered the University of Chicago. The world was still in the grip of the Great Depression, and many students were thinking about practical careers, ones that could lead to stable jobs. But Paul had no such fear. He didn't study economics because it promised money. He studied it because he believed it could explain the world and maybe even fix it. At the University of Chicago, Paul's mind opened like a door swinging wide. He was influenced by the school's rigorous intellectual environment. Professors demanded precision, and debates were constant. One of his most important mentors was Jacob Viner, a brilliant economist with a sharp tongue and a sharper mind. Viner didn't let students speak carelessly. If Paul offered a weak idea, Viner challenged it. Instead of shrinking under pressure, Paul grew stronger. Paul also met Frank Knight, another Chicago professor known for his originality. Knight's lectures were passionate and philosophical. He talked about uncertainty in markets and the moral limits of economics. These ideas fascinated Paul. Though he would later disagree with Knight's theories, he respected the man deeply and credited him for shaping his thinking. Even as a student, Paul began writing papers that attracted attention. His work stood out for its clarity, elegance, and power. Professors sometimes forgot he was still an undergraduate. His ideas, expressed with quiet confidence, were already showing a mind far beyond his years. But perhaps the most life-changing moment came when Paul read a paper by John Maynard Keynes, the British economist whose ideas would reshape the world. Keynes argued that governments could help manage economies during crises, not just sit back and watch markets fail. For Paul, it was a revelation. He later said that reading Keynes was like being blind and suddenly seeing. After completing his undergraduate studies, Paul faced a decision. Many urged him to stay in Chicago, but Paul had heard about Harvard, a place where economic theory was being transformed. With a scholarship in hand and curiosity in his heart, he made the move. The boy from Gary, who once stared at numbers on price tags, was now heading toward the center of economic thought. His path was just beginning to rise. Harvard would not only test Paul's mind, it would give him the tools to change the world. Chapter 3: Academic Battles and Bright Ideas. Harvard in the late 1930s was alive with debate. Paul Samuelson entered its campus with a quiet confidence, carrying not only his scholarship but also the weight of big ideas. The old red brick buildings, ivy-covered and historic, now became the ground where Paul would sharpen his thoughts and challenge economic tradition. Unlike Chicago, Harvard was less about firm answers and more about theoretical exploration. Paul appreciated the freedom but was also aware of the competition. Graduate students came from all over the country and the world. Many of them had strong opinions and stronger voices, yet Paul, with his calm demeanor and sharp reasoning, quickly earned respect. He didn't argue loudly. Instead, he questioned assumptions until arguments collapsed under their own weight. One of Paul's earliest challenges was finding his academic voice. In seminar rooms filled with egos and expectations, he realized he had to do more than repeat others' ideas. He had to create something new. This realization pushed him to dive deep into mathematics. He believed economics needed more than intuition. It needed structure, logic, and precision. At that time, many economists relied on words and general theories. Paul, influenced by physicists and mathematicians, wanted to give economics the same solid foundation that sciences had. He started thinking of the economy as a system, something that could be modeled, calculated, and predicted. This approach would later become his signature style. His professors took notice. Joseph Schumpeter, known for his grand theories and charisma, encouraged Paul's ambitions. While Schumpeter believed in the power of creative destruction, the way old industries die and new ones are born, Paul focused on clarity and rigor. There were different kinds of thinkers, but Schumpeter admired Paul's precision. Meanwhile, Paul also encountered Wassily Leontief, another Harvard economist who had developed input-output analysis, a way of mapping how industries depend on one another. Leontief's work excited Paul. It showed that economics could be studied with the same care as engineering or chemistry. Paul began to see how mathematical tools could explain everything from unemployment to price changes. But success didn't come without struggle. Some professors doubted Paul's methods. They felt he was too technical, too focused on numbers. One of them remarked that Paul's work was mathematical gymnastics. Paul, however, didn't argue back. He let his ideas speak for themselves, and they spoke clearly. In 1941, Paul wrote his doctoral dissertation, which would later become his first major book, Foundations of Economic Analysis. The dissertation stunned the economics department. It applied advanced mathematics specifically, constrained optimization and dynamic systems, to economics in a way no one had done before. It wasn't just a new way of explaining economics, it was a new way of doing it. Some faculty members were unsure how to grade it. They had never seen a dissertation so rigorous, so complete. After much discussion, it received one of the highest honors, and Harvard preserved it in the university library, setting it as a model for future scholars. But even as Paul rose academically, the world around him was changing. Europe was at war, and the United States would soon enter World War II. Harvard's halls buzzed with worry. Some students were drafted, others began working for the government. Paul, though physically unfit for combat, was not untouched by the war. He would soon apply his talents to national problems, economics in the service of the country. At the same time, Paul met a fellow student, Marion Crawford, who would later become his wife. Marion was intelligent, witty, and interested in politics. Their courtship was simple and sincere, often filled with long walks and thoughtful conversation. Marion didn't just support Paul, she challenged him. Their marriage, grounded in mutual respect, would become a pillar in his life. As the 1940s unfolded, Paul's ideas began to spread. He gave lectures, wrote papers, and participated in policy discussions. Younger economists admired his clarity. Older ones, even when they disagreed, could not ignore his logic. He once said, "I care more about being right than being accepted." This belief guided him through conflicts and criticism. He didn't write to impress. He wrote to understand and to help others understand. By the time Paul left Harvard, he had already reshaped what it meant to be an economist. He wasn't yet famous, but those in the know were already whispering his name with respect. His next stop would be the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, a place that had not yet made its mark in economics. That would soon change. At MIT, Paul would find freedom, a place to build, experiment, and teach. The battles of Harvard had made him sharper, now armed with bright ideas and a growing sense of purpose. He was ready to transform economics on a national and eventually global scale. Chapter 4. Cambridge Days and New Theories. When Paul Samuelson arrived at Harvard in the mid-1930s, he stepped into a world of intense ideas and academic tradition. Cambridge, Massachusetts, was home to ivy-covered buildings and a deep legacy of scholarship. But Paul wasn't there to admire history. He was there to make it. Harvard's economics department was one of the best in the country, and Paul quickly found himself surrounded by brilliant minds. Yet, he did not shrink in their presence. Instead, he grew more confident, ready to contribute something new. Unlike at Chicago, where economic theory leaned toward classical ideas and free market principles, Harvard was buzzing with something different: Keynesian economics. The ideas of John Maynard Keynes were still fresh and controversial. He had just published The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, a book that challenged the foundations of classical economics. Keynes argued that markets could fail and that governments had a role in fixing them. These concepts struck a deep chord with Paul, who had lived through the Great Depression and seen its harsh effects firsthand. But Samuelson didn't just accept Keynes's ideas. He wanted to understand and refine them. He asked, could these bold ideas be built into a solid framework? Could economics become more scientific, more exact? That question became his mission. During long hours in Widner Library and late nights scribbling equations in notebooks, Paul began to shape a new way of thinking. He believed economics could be expressed through mathematics, precisely, logically, and clearly. This approach was still rare at the time. Many economists used words and diagrams, not symbols and formulas. But Paul saw an opportunity. He would use the language of math to make economic theory stronger. His professors noticed Joseph Schumpeter, one of Harvard's most famous economists, had a theatrical personality and grand ideas about capitalism and innovation. Though Schumpeter's style was different from Paul's, he appreciated the young scholar's brilliance. Schumpeter once said that Paul was the only student who ever scared him. Paul didn't do it with arrogance. He did it with insight and precision. Another mentor, Vasily Leontief, was making waves with his mathematical models of industrial production. Paul was fascinated by Leontief's work, especially how it showed real-world economic relationships in numbers. These ideas would later influence Paul's own models and approach to systems thinking. Despite his growing reputation, Paul remained humble. He was still a student, learning and experimenting. His curiosity drove him. He wanted to know not just what worked in theory, but what helped in practice. He was especially interested in how governments could use policy to guide economies, preventing recessions, managing inflation, creating jobs. One of his early breakthroughs was his concept of comparative statics. It was a method to compare two different economic outcomes based on changes in one variable. Though technical, it helped economists better understand cause and effect. This was typical of Paul, taking a complex idea and making it practical. At the same time, Samuelson's life outside the classroom was beginning to change. He met Marion Crawford, a young woman who shared his love of books and thoughtful conversation. Marion had her own strong opinions and a sharp wit. Their connection was immediate. While Paul worked on abstract theories, Marion helped keep his feet on the ground. She asked questions, challenged his ideas, and supported his ambitions. They would marry in 1938, forming a partnership that would last a lifetime. As the decade progressed, the world outside Harvard was changing rapidly. War clouds gathered over Europe, and the United States was inching closer to involvement in World War II. These events didn't just affect politics, they reshaped economies. Governments began planning production, setting prices, and hiring economists to advise on national strategy. Paul found himself in demand. Even before completing his doctorate, he was invited to join research teams and advisory groups. He worked on wartime economics, helping the government understand how to mobilize industry and control inflation. These real-world problems only strengthened his belief that economics should be useful, not just in books, but in society. By 1941, Paul completed his doctoral thesis, a work so advanced that some professors were unsure how to evaluate it. It was filled with mathematics, but not just for show. Every equation had a purpose. Every model answered a question. The thesis would later be published as Foundations of Economic Analysis, and it would change the field forever. Before that happened, though, Paul made a key decision. He accepted a job offer from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, a school better known at the time for engineering than for economics. Some people wondered why a rising star would leave Harvard for a place without a strong economic tradition. But Paul saw something others missed: potential. At MIT, he would have the freedom to build something new, to teach, research, and shape the future of economics on his own terms. It was a risk, but Paul believed in ideas more than reputation. And so, with his new degree, a young family, and a mind full of possibility, Paul Samuelson left Harvard. He didn't yet know that he would make MIT the world's leading center for economic thought. He only knew that the journey had just begun and the best ideas were still ahead. Chapter 5: Economics with Elegance. The Foundations of Economic Analysis. When Paul Samuelson arrived at MIT, the campus didn't yet have the same reputation for economics that it did for science and engineering. But Samuelson didn't see that as a problem. In fact, he saw an opportunity, a blank slate, a place where he could build something meaningful. While most young professors would have felt intimidated by the task, Samuelson rolled up his sleeves and got to work. The early 1940s were filled with big questions for economists. The Great Depression had shattered faith in classical models. World War II demanded that governments manage entire economies. People needed new answers, and Paul believed economics could provide them if it could be made clearer, more logical, more exact. At the core of Samuelson's belief was this idea: economics should be like science. That meant it needed clear assumptions, logical steps, and mathematical proofs. It wasn't enough to say what might happen. One had to show why and how. His goal wasn't to make economics more difficult, but to make it more precise, more honest. It was this vision that led him to write what would become one of the most important books in economic history, Foundations of Economic Analysis. He had first written the ideas in his PhD thesis at Harvard, and even then, his professors didn't quite know what to make of it. This is either brilliant or completely crazy, one examiner had said, but over time, the brilliance became undeniable. Samuelson had taken ideas from thermodynamics and applied them to economics. He used comparative statics, a tool for comparing different economic outcomes before and after a change, to clarify how markets responded to shocks. He wasn't just applying mathematics for the sake of it. Samuelson made sure that every equation had meaning. He had an elegant way of writing, concise, structured, beautiful. He believed that if you couldn't express an idea clearly, you probably didn't understand it well enough. When Foundations of Economic Analysis was published in 1947, it didn't cause an immediate splash. It was dense, technical, and not for casual readers. But among economists, it became a classic. It laid out a unified way of thinking that connected microeconomics and macroeconomics. Samuelson showed that under certain conditions, individual choices could lead to market-wide outcomes, and when those conditions failed, markets could break down. One of the most memorable ideas in the book was the correspondence principle, a bridge between equilibrium and stability. Samuelson explained how small changes in conditions could predict whether a market system would return to equilibrium or spiral away from it. This mattered in a real-world sense. It could help governments understand when to intervene. Back at MIT, Samuelson was gaining respect, but also something more rare: admiration. His students loved how he explained things. He didn't just teach them formulas. He taught them how to think. He was demanding but fair. He spoke quickly, with energy and purpose, filling blackboards with clear logic and insight. And when students struggled, he didn't mock them. He slowed down, repeated the idea, and asked them to try again. One of his most lasting contributions at this time wasn't just the Foundations book, it was the way he blended mathematical rigor with economic intuition. Before Samuelson, many economists wrote pages of text to express one idea. Samuelson could express that same idea in a single equation and still make it understandable. He turned the economics into a language of clarity. The academic world noticed Paul began receiving invitations to lecture, to advise, to collaborate. Other departments started to model themselves after MIT. Soon, the economics department that had once been an afterthought was becoming a world leader, largely because of one man's vision. But Paul remained modest. He often said, "Good questions outrun answers." For him, discovery was never finished. Even while his own reputation was growing, he made time to read new papers, learn new methods, and listen to others, especially young scholars with fresh ideas. At home, his life was also full. Marion was a steady presence, always supportive, always listening. Their home was often filled with laughter, books, and talk of ideas. They raised 6 children together, and while Paul worked hard, he never lost sight of family. His children would later remember him not just as a genius, but as a kind and attentive father. By the late 1940s, Paul Samuelson was no longer just a brilliant student. He had become a pioneer. He was redefining economics, not by throwing away the past, but by building on it, improving it, polishing it into something more solid. He believed that economics could serve people, guide policy, and make society better, but only if it was rooted in logic, clarity, and truth. Foundations of Economic Analysis didn't just earn him praise, it set the stage for everything that would follow for the textbook that would teach millions, for the Nobel Prize that would come decades later, and for the generations of economists he would mentor. Samuelson had done more than publish a book. He had built a foundation, not just for analysis, but for a lifetime of ideas. Copyright notice. Cool English Channel. All rights reserved. This video and its content are protected by copyright law. Unauthorized copying, redistribution, re-uploading, or modification of this content is strictly prohibited and may result in legal action. Respect the creator. Do not steal. Chapter 6. Teaching a Generation. The MIT Years. When Paul Samuelson walked into a classroom at MIT, students sat up straighter. He didn't need to raise his voice or speak dramatically. There was something about the way he explained ideas, precise, energetic, and deeply logical, that made students want to listen. His chalk moved fast across the board, leaving behind a trail of formulas and graphs, but it was his voice, calm, fast-paced, and confident, that guided them through each concept. In the 1950s, MIT's economics department was still young. Before Samuelson, it had not been known as a place for great economic thinking. But Paul had different plans. He believed that MIT could become a center of excellence, a place where brilliant students from all over the world could be trained to think clearly and solve real problems. Slowly, with care and effort, he helped make that dream a reality. Paul did not just teach students, he built an entire program. He helped recruit faculty, shape the curriculum, and create a culture of intellectual discipline. But most of all, he mentored. He worked closely with graduate students, helping them develop their own ideas. He encouraged debate, but expected clarity. He demanded precision, but gave support. He had little patience for careless thinking, but endless time for genuine effort. Students who studied under Samuelson often said the same thing. He changed the way they thought. He didn't just give answers, he taught them how to ask better questions. He believed economics was a serious subject, but he also believed in elegance. A solution was not just correct, it had to be beautiful. He once said that solving an economic problem was like solving a puzzle. When you found the right answer, everything fit together perfectly. His classes became famous. Young economists from across the country applied to MIT, hoping to learn from him. The department began to grow. With Samuelson leading the way, MIT attracted other great economists, including Robert Solow, Franco Modigliani, and Kenneth Arrow. These names would one day win their own Nobel Prizes, but in those early days, they worked side by side, shaping the future of economic science. But Samuelson wasn't satisfied with teaching only a few hundred students each year. He wanted to reach more. So, in 1948, he did something that would affect millions. He published Economics, an introductory analysis, a college textbook for beginners. The textbook was different from others. It was clear, readable, and engaging. It included the latest economic ideas, including Keynesian theory, which many older books still ignored. Samuelson explained supply and demand, inflation, unemployment, and government policy in simple, logical steps. He included graphs to make ideas visual. He used examples from everyday life to show why economics mattered. The response was incredible. The book quickly became the most widely used economics textbook in the United States, and later around the world. It was translated into many languages and sold millions of copies. For decades, it remained the standard for how economics was taught to college students. Through this one book, Samuelson reached students in small colleges, big universities, and even countries he had never visited. Yet, even as his fame grew, Samuelson remained focused on his work. He kept refining the textbook, updating it with new data and ideas. Each edition was carefully revised because he believed students deserved the best possible explanations. He also continued to teach at MIT year after year, even when he could have chosen to rest or retire early. At MIT, he developed a tradition. Every fall, he gave the opening lecture for new graduate students. It was called Baby Economics, and it was legendary. Students, professors, and even visitors packed the room. Samuelson would walk in with no notes, take a piece of chalk, and speak for over an hour. explaining the foundations of economics as if he were painting a picture. He made it seem easy, though everyone knew it was anything but. But perhaps what made Samuelson most special as a teacher was his humility. Despite his genius, he treated students with respect. He listened. He encouraged. He believed that learning was not just about talent, it was about effort. And he believed every student had the potential to contribute something valuable. Outside the classroom, Samuelson also began writing regularly for the public. He became a columnist for Newsweek, sharing economic insights in simple language. His goal was always the same: to make economics understandable to ordinary people. He believed that citizens should not be afraid of economic ideas. They should be able to think critically about taxes, trade, jobs, and policy. In a time when economics often seemed distant and complex, Samuelson brought it closer to home. By the 1960s, Samuelson had transformed MIT into a powerhouse of economics. It was not only producing top research, it was training leaders. Many of his students went on to become professors, government advisors, and central bankers. They carried his lessons with them, his clarity, his curiosity, and his commitment to truth. Teaching, for Samuelson, was never just a job, it was a calling. He once said that if he had to choose between winning a Nobel Prize and training a great student, he would choose the student. Ideas could last, but people could multiply those ideas across generations. In the halls of MIT, Paul Samuelson's footsteps echoed for decades. He gave everything he had to his students, his books, and his field. And in return, he received something more lasting than fame. He shaped the minds that would shape the world. Chapter 7. Policy and Practice. Advising the Nation. Paul Samuelson never ran for office, never made speeches on campaign trails, and never held a government job full-time. Yet, behind closed doors in Washington, his voice mattered deeply. Presidents, senators, and cabinet members listened carefully when Samuelson spoke, because he spoke with clarity, logic, and insight. His advice wasn't driven by politics, but by a lifelong pursuit of economic truth. In the years following World War II, America faced enormous challenges. Soldiers were coming home, industries were shifting from war production to peace, and leaders feared the economy might slip back into depression. This was a time when economic advice was not just helpful, it was essential. Samuelson's early writings, especially Foundations of Economic Analysis and his textbook, had already made him famous in academic circles. But it was his deep understanding of Keynesian economics, ideas that suggested governments could stabilize the economy, that drew the attention of national leaders. One of the first presidents to seek Samuelson's insight was John F. Kennedy. In the early 1960s, the American economy was not in crisis, but it was sluggish. Growth was slow, unemployment was higher than expected, and there was concern about the future. President Kennedy wanted new ideas, and so he turned to the nation's best economists, including Paul Samuelson. Though Samuelson did not accept a formal position in the White House, he became a trusted voice. He worked closely with Walter Heller, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisers, who often passed along Samuelson's suggestions to the president. Samuelson was careful, however. He believed that good economists should remain independent, free to speak the truth, even when it wasn't popular. In 1961, Samuelson helped shape one of Kennedy's most important economic decisions, a major tax cut to stimulate the economy. At the time, this idea was controversial. Cutting taxes while keeping government spending high was risky, but Samuelson explained that, in a slow economy, the government needed to boost demand, to put more money in people's hands so they would spend and businesses would grow. The advice worked. The tax cut passed. In the following years, economic growth returned, and unemployment dropped. Though many factors played a role, Kennedy's advisors believed Samuelson's voice had been critical. One aide even said, "He gave us the theory, we just had to follow the logic." But Samuelson was not afraid to speak up when he disagreed. In fact, he often warned against overconfidence. As the US became more involved in the Vietnam War, government spending soared. Some economists celebrated the strong growth, but Samuelson was cautious. He warned about rising inflation and the long-term cost of military spending. He knew that wars, while sometimes good for short-term demand, were dangerous for a nation's budget and values. Later, during the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson, Samuelson continued to offer private advice. Again, he declined a full-time position, saying, "An economist should remain above the political storm," but his influence was everywhere, shaping tax policy, social programs, and economic forecasts. In 1966, when Time magazine featured him on its cover, it called him the economist who makes economists. The article praised not only his scholarship, but also his rare ability to make theory useful in practice. He was, by then, a bridge between two worlds, the abstract world of models and equations, and the real world of jobs, prices, and policies. Yet Samuelson never let his success make him overconfident. He understood that economies were complex. Even the best models could not predict everything. He often reminded students and policymakers that humility was essential in economics. "We must always be ready," he said, "to let evidence change our minds." Throughout the 1970s, Samuelson remained active in public discussions. He continued writing for Newsweek, where his columns reached millions. He used plain language but never simplified the truth. He explained inflation, energy shocks, and global trade with honesty and care. He did not push a single agenda. Instead, he gave readers the tools to think for themselves. Though he advised presidents of both political parties, Samuelson did not belong to any single ideology. He supported policies that worked, whether they came from the left or the right. He believed in markets, but he also believed in fairness. He trusted the power of prices, but he also saw the value of government action when markets failed. As other economists fought on television or in newspapers, Samuelson stayed calm. He believed that the real test of an idea was not how loud you shouted it, but how well it worked in the real world. This quiet, steady wisdom made him a voice of reason in times of noise. By the end of this period in his life, Paul Samuelson had done something rare. Without holding office, without chasing headlines, he had helped shape a nation's economic direction. He had proven that ideas, clear, honest, well-tested ideas, could guide policy just as well as power or politics. For Samuelson, the job of the economist was not just to write papers or win arguments. It was to serve the public good, whether in a classroom or the halls of government. He kept asking the same question: how can we make the world work better for everyone? Chapter 8. A Nobel Honor, Recognition, and Legacy. By the early 1970s, Paul Samuelson was a name known far beyond the world of academic economics. His textbook had educated millions, his theories had shaped government policy, and his voice in Newsweek had become a trusted guide for the public. Still, even with all his achievements, one moment stood above the rest, a moment of international recognition that would mark a new chapter in his life. In 1970, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences made an announcement. Paul Samuelson would receive the first ever Nobel Prize in economic sciences. Though Nobel Prizes had been awarded since 1901 in fields like physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace, economics had only just been added. Samuelson's name was the first to appear in this new category, and it was no surprise. The prize committee said he had done more than any other contemporary economist to raise the level of scientific analysis in economic theory. It was a perfect summary of his life's work. When Samuelson heard the news, he was honored, but also humble. In interviews, he praised his teachers, colleagues, and students. He reminded people that economics was a team effort. "We all stand on the shoulders of those who came before us," he said, borrowing a phrase from Isaac Newton. The ceremony took place in Stockholm, Sweden. Dressed in formal attire, Samuelson accepted the prize from the King of Sweden. In his Nobel lecture, he spoke not only about equations and theories, but about the purpose of economics to improve lives, reduce suffering, and make society more just. The audience listened carefully. Many were moved, not just by his words, but by the quiet passion behind them. Winning the Nobel Prize did not change Samuelson's daily habits. He still came to his office at MIT early each morning. he still met with students, answered letters, and wrote columns. He once joked, "I'm still just a working economist. The work doesn't stop just because someone gave me a medal." But the prize did open new doors. Universities around the world invited him to speak. Leaders from developing nations asked for his advice. Samuelson used these opportunities to promote strong, evidence-based economics. He encouraged governments to invest in education, infrastructure, and health. He warned against corruption and short-term thinking. Always, he emphasized the importance of long-term planning and careful analysis. Despite his fame, Samuelson remained approachable. Students still knocked on his office door. Journalists still called to ask for his opinion. And he continued to revise his textbook, adding new chapters and examples to keep it up to date. One of the most important lessons Samuelson taught, both in his writing and in his life, was that economics is not a fixed science. It grows, it changes. New problems require new tools. While some economists defended old theories as if they were sacred, Samuelson welcomed change. He believed in progress. When the facts change, he liked to say, "I changed my mind. What do you do?" He also believed that economics must stay connected to real life. A theory that looked perfect on paper but didn't work in practice was not useful. He called for a balance between mathematics and common sense, between models and reality, between beauty and truth. The Nobel Prize also gave Samuelson a platform to speak more boldly about the responsibilities of economists. He warned against becoming too political or too proud. He reminded his peers that they had a duty to the public, not just to impress each other, but to help the world make better choices. As the 1970s turned into the 1980s, the world economy faced new challenges: oil shocks, inflation, rising inequality, and debates about government versus market roles. Samuelson did not claim to have all the answers, but he remained part of the conversation, asking questions, testing ideas, and guiding the next generation. By now, Samuelson had become more than just a scholar. He was a symbol of what economics could be at its best: careful, honest, and useful. His Nobel Prize was not just a reward for past work, it was a light shining on his future impact, and on the legacy he would leave behind. Chapter 9. A Life in Reflection. Later Years and Wisdom. By the 1980s and 1990s, Paul Samuelson had become an elder statesman in the world of economics. Though no longer a young scholar racing to develop new theories, his mind remained sharp, his voice still carried weight, and his presence at MIT continued to inspire generations of students. Unlike some intellectuals who fade quietly into retirement, Samuelson stayed active, writing, advising, and most of all, thinking. He continued to arrive at his office early in the morning. The routine remained the same: coffee, reading new journals, writing notes, meeting with students. He often said that thinking was his form of exercise. Even into his 70s and 80s, he read widely, not just economics, but history, science, and philosophy. He believed that to be a great economist, one had to understand the world in all its parts. Many of his students from earlier decades had become leading economists themselves, some even Nobel laureates. They came back to visit Samuelson, often sitting in his office, to discuss new theories or share their own research. These visits weren't formal. They were friendly, filled with laughter and honest curiosity. Samuelson listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, his comments were sharp, kind, and precise. At times, people asked him what he was most proud of: his textbook, his theories, his Nobel Prize. But Samuelson rarely gave a simple answer. Instead, he said he was proud to have helped build economics into a real science, one that could be tested, refined, and used to help society. He was proud, too, of the many students he had taught and the way they carried his ideas into the future. In these later years, Samuelson also reflected more deeply on the changes he had witnessed. When he began his career, economics was still a relatively young field, with few tools and limited data. By the 1990s, it had become a global discipline, full of computers, mathematical models, and massive amounts of information. Samuelson welcomed these changes, but he also warned against becoming too confident in numbers alone. Economics, he once said, must never forget the human side. Behind every graph is a family. Behind every policy is a person. It was this balanced view, part scientist, part humanist, that made him so respected. He never lost sight of the reason he became an economist in the first place, to understand the forces shaping people's lives, and to help make those lives better. He continued writing for Newsweek until the early 1980s, and his textbook went through many more editions. Even when he stopped active publishing, he kept offering advice to students, government officials, and fellow economists. His opinions were always sought after, not because he spoke loudly, but because he spoke wisely. Despite all his achievements, Samuelson never saw himself as finished. He believed learning was a lifelong task. Even in his final years at MIT, he could be seen walking through the campus with a book in hand, or sitting quietly in the library, thinking, "There is always more to learn," he would say. He also became a kind of historian for his field. In interviews and lectures, he shared stories about great economists he had known, Keynes, Wiener, Knight, and many others. His memory was detailed, and his stories were filled with humor, humility, and warmth. Younger economists listened closely. Through Samuelson, they felt connected not just to theory, but to the human chain of thought that had built the discipline. In these years, Paul also spent more time with his family. He had married in 1938 and had 6 children. His family had grown. There were now grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They saw him not as a global thinker or Nobel Prize winner, but as a kind and curious man who loved ideas and asked thoughtful questions at the dinner table. His home was full of books, papers, and notes, evidence of a life spent in pursuit of understanding. Yet he also loved music, conversation, and a good joke. Visitors often found him smiling, with a story ready to tell or a question waiting to be asked. Retirement, for him, was not a stopping point, it was just a new chapter in the same story of learning and reflection. As the new millennium approached, Samuelson was often asked what the future of economics would look like. He didn't claim to know, but he hoped that it would become more inclusive, more global, and more honest. He believed that young economists should study history, question assumptions, and never forget the real-world impact of their ideas. Even in old age, he was more curious than certain, and that, perhaps, was his greatest wisdom. Chapter 10. The Enduring Voice of a Visionary. Even in his final years, Paul Samuelson never stopped thinking. While others retired quietly, he remained a presence, writing, mentoring, and reflecting on the world he had studied for decades. Too many young economists meeting him felt like stepping into history. Yet Paul never acted superior. He listened closely, asked sharp questions, and offered insights that often cut to the heart of the matter. By the time he reached his 80s, Samuelson had lived through the Great Depression, 2 world wars, the Cold War, and numerous financial crises. He had seen economies rise and fall, ideologies clash and fade, and technologies reshape industries. Through it all, he had remained remarkably consistent, not in repeating the same ideas, but in his commitment to clarity, logic, and evidence. His writing, even in old age, retained its signature grace. He still published in journals and gave talks at conferences. He wasn't interested in being famous. He had already won the Nobel Prize, after all. But in staying part of the conversation, economics was, to him, a living language, one that never stopped evolving, and he wanted to keep speaking it. Many former students returned to visit him, not just for advice, but out of deep respect. Some were now professors themselves, shaping the next generation. Others held high positions in governments, central banks, or international organizations. All of them, in some way, carried a part of Samuelson's legacy. They often joked that whenever they faced a hard problem, they'd ask themselves, what would Paul say? He never stopped reading. Newspapers, academic papers, new books. Samuelson remained curious. He was especially interested in how new fields, like behavioral economics, were questioning old assumptions. He welcomed the debates. Unlike some scholars who feared change, Samuelson believed that the discipline should always question itself. If economics becomes too proud to adapt, he once said, it will be left behind. Paul's later life was filled with routine but never boredom. He lived in Belmont, near Boston, and kept a regular schedule. Mornings were often spent writing or reading. Afternoons might include a phone call with a colleague or student. He still visited MIT from time to time, walking slowly through the hallways where he had once lectured. The walls had changed, the faces were younger, but the spirit of inquiry, the spark, was still there. He had helped build that. He also reflected on the mistakes of economics, including his own. He admitted that models could never capture the full complexity of human behavior. But he still believed that good theory, informed by data and grounded in history, was essential for understanding and improving the world. We must not become prisoners of our equations, he wrote late in life. We must remain students of the real. On December 13, 2009, Paul Samuelson passed away in his home. He was 94. News of his death traveled quickly, and tributes came from around the world. Economists, journalists, policymakers, and former students all shared their memories. Many called him the father of modern economics. Others simply called him teacher. MIT held a memorial service, and people spoke not just of his brilliance, but of his kindness. They remembered the soft humor in his lectures, the time he took with confused students, and the quiet encouragement he gave to young researchers. One former student said, "He taught us how to think, not what to think, but how." Samuelson's legacy lives on in many forms. His textbook continues to be studied in universities worldwide. His papers are still cited in new research. But perhaps more importantly, his spirit, the joy of learning, the humility before complexity, the refusal to settle for easy answers, remains a part of economic thinking. Years after his death, a young economist at MIT gave a lecture using one of Samuelson's early models. As he drew the graph on the board, a student raised her hand and asked a difficult question. The professor paused, smiled, and said, "That's a good question. Samuelson would have loved it." In the end, Paul Samuelson did more than explain how markets worked. He showed the world that economics could be a force for clarity, compassion, and progress. He made the invisible visible, not just in charts and theories, but in lives changed by ideas. His voice, sharp and elegant, still echoes not only in books and lectures, but in every thoughtful question asked in a classroom, every policy shaped by careful analysis, and every learner inspired by the beauty of understanding. Thanks for learning with Ku English. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.